Welcome to the light novel xianni, or Renegade Immortal by author ENG. Audio presentation provided by Board Panda Cafe. Chapter 1, Leaving Home. Taizhu sat on the side of a little road in the village, looking at the blue sky in a daze. Taizhu was not his real name but a nickname. Due to his poor health as a child, his father was afraid he might not live, so he was given this nickname as a tradition. His real name was Wang Lin. The Wang family was considered a big family name in the area, a family of carpenters. The Wang family was well known in the area, and they owned a number of shops that sold wood products. Taizhu's father was the second son of the family. He was born from a concubine, therefore, he couldn't take over the family business, so he left the house after he got married and settled in this village. However, due to his father being a skilled carpenter, Taizhu's family was pretty well off, and they did not have to worry about food or clothes. They were well respected within the village. Ever since he was little, Taizhu has been very intelligent. He loved to read books and thought deeply about matters. Almost everyone in the village agreed that he was a prodigy. Every time his father heard someone praise Taizhu, the wrinkles on his face would fade, and he would reveal a happy smile. His mother cared for him a lot. One could say that he had grown up in his parents' love. He knew that his parents had high expectations of him. Other children his age were all working in the fields while he sat at home reading. The more he read, the more he thought about. He yearned for the world outside of the village. Taizhu raised his head and looked at the end of the road. After letting out a sigh, he closed his book, got up, and walked home. His father was sitting in the courtyard. Holding a pipe, he took a deep breath and asked, "Taizhu, how are your studies?" As Taizhu walked through the door, Taizhu muttered a few words as he passed by. His father shook the ashes out of his pipe, rose up, and said, "Taizhu, you have to study properly. Next year is the district exam. Whether you have a future or not will all depend on this exam. Don't end up like me, who will spend my entire life in a village. Enough, you complain about this every day. If you ask me, our Taizhu will definitely pass the exam." Taizhu's mother carried over some food and set it on the table. She gestured at the two to come and eat. Taizhu responded with a sound, then he sat down and casually ate a few mouthfuls. His mother affectionately looked at him and passed him the few pieces of meat there were. "Dad, is fourth uncle almost here?" Taizhu asked as he raised his head. Calculating the time, it should be within these next few days. Your fourth uncle is more successful than your father. Hey, Taizhu's mom, have the special dishes prepared for fourth uncle all been packed? The moment Taizhu's father mentioned fourth uncle, there was a hint of sadness on his face. His mom nodded and emotionally said, "Taizhu, your fourth uncle, is a very good person. In these past few years, it was all thanks to him that your father's wood carvings have stayed at a good price. If you are able to achieve success, don't forget to repay your fourth uncle." As Taizhu's mom was talking, the sound of a horse was heard outside the door. Following the sound of the horse-drawn carriage, a hearty laugh could be heard. "Second brother, open the door." Taizhu was surprised. He immediately rushed to open the main gate. He saw a strong middle-aged man with bright eyes standing outside. When he saw Taizhu, he laughed and rubbed Taizhu's head. Smiling, he said, "Taizhu, I only haven't seen you in half a year, and you have grown taller again." Taizhu's parents immediately stood up. His father, smiling, said, "Fourth brother, I figured it was about time you arrived. Hurry inside." "Taizhu, why haven't you gotten a chair for your fourth uncle yet?" Taizhu happily agreed. He hurried back into the house, took out a chair, and placed it next to the dining table. He carefully wiped it with his sleeves while looking hopefully at the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man winked in his direction and jokingly said, "Taizhu, since when were you so diligent? I remember the last time I was here, you were not like this." Taizhu's father glanced at Taizhu and said, "This little rascal was just inquiring about when you would arrive." The middle-aged man saw Taizhu blushing and laughingly said, "Taizhu, your fourth uncle hasn't forgotten his promise to you." After he finished speaking, he took out 2 books and placed them on the table. Taizhu excitedly cheered and then flipped through the books. He could barely contain his excitement. Taizhu's mom kindly glanced at her son and said to the middle-aged man, "Fourth brother, your older brother is always thinking of you. You should stay for a few more days this time." The middle-aged man shook his head and said, "Second sister-in-law, there are many matters to attend to in the family these days. I must head home early tomorrow morning. After this busy time, I'll come back and see you guys." He gave his second brother a regretful look. Taizhu's father sighed, saying, "Don't listen to my wife. Properly pack the goods tomorrow. The family's matters are more important. We can meet next time." The middle-aged man looked at Taizhu's father and asked, "Second brother, Taizhu is 15 years old, yes?" Taizhu's father nodded and said, "After this year, this little rascal is going to be 16. In a flash, more than 10 years have quickly passed by. He looked at his son dotingly. The middle-aged man pondered for a while and said, in a serious tone, "Second brother, second sister-in-law, I have something to tell you. The Heng-Yue sect is taking in disciples. This year, the family has 3 recommendation slots, and I received one of them." Taizhu's father was stunned and said, with a pale face, "Heng-Yue sect? The Heng-Yue sect that is full of immortals?" The middle-aged man smiled, nodded, and said, "Second brother, it is that very immortal sect. Our family is still a prominent one in the area, and has the qualifications to recommend potential disciples. You know my boy, he can't really study, but he is good with swords and knives. I doubt the immortal sect will take my son. This spot is really precious. I know Taizhu has been very smart since he was little and has always loved to study. He might have a chance." Taizhu's mother felt delighted and said, "Fourth brother, this. The middle-aged man rubbed Taizhu's head and said, "Second brother, second sister-in-law, let this matter be settled. Let Taizhu try, if he really gets accepted, it is his fortune." Taizhu confusedly looked at his parents and his fourth uncle. He wasn't able to understand what was going on. Immortals. What are immortals? Taizhu softly and hesitantly asked. The middle-aged man's face turned serious. Looking at Taizhu, he said, "Taizhu, immortals are those who can fly in the sky. They are simply not something we mortals can understand." Taizhu was confused but grew curious about immortals. Taizhu's father excitedly got up, pulled Taizhu's mom, and was about to bow to the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man quickly pulled them up and sincerely said, "Second brother, what are you doing? My mother died early. If it wasn't for second brother's mother taking care of me, I wouldn't be here today. Taizhu is my nephew, and this is the least I can do." Taizhu's father started crying. He heavily patted the middle-aged man's back, nodded his head, and sternly said to Taizhu, "Remember, Wang Lin, never forget what your fourth uncle has done for us, or else, I will not consider you my son." Taizhu's heart trembled. Although he was ignorant about immortals, he could tell from his parents' expressions that they viewed this matter with great importance. He knelt in front of his fourth uncle and kowtowed a few times. The middle-aged man pulled up Taizhu and praised him. "Good child. You get ready, and I'll pick you up at the end of the month." That night, Taizhu went to bed early. He could still hear sounds from his father and fourth uncle. Father was very happy. Even though he rarely drank, he had to drink a few cups with fourth uncle today. Immortals, what were they? Taizu's heart was very excited. He knew in his heart that this was an opportunity to see the outside world. Fourth uncle left early the next morning. Taiju and his parents saw him off at the village entrance. On the way back, Taiju clearly noticed that his father looked a lot younger. His eyes were filled with hope. The expectations in his eyes were much greater than the time he wanted Taiju to pass the district exam. There were no secrets in the village, even if it was how many pups a dog gave birth to. Everyone in the village would hear the news. Soon, everyone in the village heard the news from Taizu's mother, and all the neighbors came to visit. Everyone's gazes toward Taiju were different from before. Some were filled with envy, and others with jealousy. The Wang family gave birth to a good son. He has been accepted as a disciple of the Heng-Yue sect. I have watched this child, Taiju, as he grew up. He was very smart ever since he was little. Now, he is a Heng-Yue sect disciple. He has a very promising future. Taiju, you have great talent. When you are successful in the future, don't forget to come back and visit. These talks filled Taizu's ears, acting like Taiju was already a Heng-Yue sect disciple. Every time his parents heard it, they couldn't stop smiling. The wrinkles on their faces had lessened greatly. Whenever Taiju walked alone in the village, all the villagers would passionately ask him about this and that. There were even people who told their kids to follow Taiju as an example. Half a month passed by quickly. The news of Taiju becoming a Heng-Yue sect disciple had spread quickly. All of the nearby villagers had come to see Taiju. Everyone who came by brought gifts. Taizu's parents couldn't reject them, but as they left, Taizu's parents planned return gifts. According to Taizu's father, our son will be an immortal in the future, so he can't owe any favors. We will prepare return gifts for all the visitors. Soon, the Wang family learned that Taizu's fourth uncle gave his son's spot to Taiju. One after another, they came to congratulate him. Taizu's father attached great importance to the visiting relatives because many of them used to look down on him in the past and drove him out of the family all those years ago. Now that they were all coming to visit him, he felt like his years of sorrow were instantly swept away. He and Taizu's mother discussed a bit and decided to properly entertain everyone. They spent a fortune to hire the village teacher to write invitations to send to their relatives. The village teacher didn't want money, he wanted Taiju to acknowledge that he grew up studying in his care. Taiju had no objections as this was the truth. After the invitations were sent to most of the Wang family members, there were so many people that Taizu's dad had to move the party's location to the village square and set up a feast. The villagers helped entertain the guests. As they spoke to each other, they would praise Taiju endlessly. Taizu's dad brought his wife and son to the village entrance to personally greet the guests and introduce each relative to Taiju. This is your third grandfather. When father left the family, your third grandfather secretly helped a lot. Taiju, you have to remember to repay his kindness, Taizu's father said as he helped a white-haired old man. Taiju quickly nodded. The old man looked at Taiju and said, "Second brother, time passes by so fast. Your son is already this big. His future is already brighter than yours." Taizu's father's face was full of radiance. He smiled and said, "Third grandfather, Taiju, has been smart ever since he was a kid. He was bound to be better than me. Take your time. Wife, help support third grandfather." Taizu's mother quickly helped the old man walk toward the feast. Seeing the old man leaving, Taizu's father let out a snort and said to Taiju, "That old guy looked down on your dad and forced me away. Now that you have a good future, he comes to congratulate me. He is just that kind of relative." Taiju cluelessly nodded and asked, "Is fourth uncle coming?" Taizu's father shook his head. Your fourth uncle sent a letter. He won't be able to come back until the end of the month. At that moment, another carriage arrived at the village entrance. A 50-plus-year-old man came out. He looked at Taizu's father and said, "Second brother, congratulations." Taizu's father's face turned complicated, and he said, "Big brother." The old man's eyes swept across, and he looked at Taizu. He smiled. "Second brother, so this is your son. Not bad. Maybe he will really be selected." Taizu's father frowned, stretched, and said, "Taizu might not have much merit, but he is smart and loves to read books. He is bound to be selected." That is not necessarily true. When immortal sects look for disciples, there are very strict requirements. I see that this kid is very dumb. "Going will be a waste of time for him," said a haughty voice from the carriage. Then a 16 or 17-year-old boy stepped out. The young boy looked very pretty. He had eyebrows like scimitars, a face like Guan Yu, and eyes full of disdain. Taizu's father glared at him, and Wang Lin gave him a deep look but didn't say anything. The old man's face changed colors, and he shouted, "Wang Chuo, how can you be so rude? This is your second uncle and your little brother Wang Lin. Why haven't you greeted them?" He turned to Taizu's father and said, "My son's words are ugly. Second brother, don't mind him, but..." As he was talking, he suddenly turned and said, "But second brother, it is not a simple matter for these immortals to accept a disciple, it is a matter of fate. This time, it's because the Heng Yue sect was very interested in my son that our Wang family was given 3 spots, including his." Taizu's father snorted and said, "If your son can do it, then my son will definitely be selected." The youth laughed, not caring about the old man's words. With disdain, he said, "So, you are second uncle. I suggest you don't be so optimistic. The way of cultivation is very complex, and only 1 in 10,000 people can even learn it. How can he compete with me, who, while not being an official disciple yet, was personally selected by an immortal teacher?" The old man's face flashed with a color of pride, and then he scolded the youth and brought him toward the feast. "Taizu, don't worry. Even if you are not selected, it doesn't matter. There is always the district exam next year," Taizu's father earnestly said after suppressing his anger. Wang Lin confidently whispered, "Dad, don't worry. I'll be selected." Taizu's dad gently patted his son's shoulder. His eyes were filled with rays of hope. One after another, they greeted many of relatives. Taizu's father took him back to the feast. In front of them was a bustling scene of people celebrating. Taizu's father cried out, "My dear relatives, my fellow villagers, I, Wang Taizu, am not a very cultured man and don't have much to say, but today, I'm very happy because my son has a chance to become a Heng Yue sect disciple. This is the happiest moment of my life. I won't say more, but thank you all for coming." He raised his cup and drained it of the wine within. "Second brother, your son has been very smart ever since he was little. He will definitely be selected, like Wang Zu's son, and become an immortal. Second brother, having a son like Taizu means you have not lived your life in vain. In the future, all you have to do is wait to enjoy the good fortune. Taizu, you must make your father proud. You must enter the Heng Yue sect no matter what." There were numerous bright scenes everywhere. The sounds of celebration came from all sides. However, there were many people like Wang Chuo's father who, on the surface, were giving their congratulations but, in their hearts, had always looked down upon Taizu's father and Taizu himself. Wang Chuo's father looked at his son and then at Taizu. He felt very dissatisfied. Fourth brother's actions were outside of his expectations, but as the immortals weren't blind, there was no way Taizu would be selected. People passed by, one by one. Taizu's father pulled Taizhu around from table to give a toast and introduce various unknown relatives to him. Today, Taizu's father had consumed a lot of wine. He had never been this well regarded before. The feast lasted until it was very late, and everyone started to head home. Before leaving, and still with a look of contempt, Wang Chuo, while no one noticed, whispered to Taizhu, "Little fool, you won't be selected. You're not good enough." He left with his father as he displayed a smile full of contempt. After returning home, Taizhu lay on his bed. He secretly decided in his heart that he had to be selected no matter what. Half a month passed by quickly. Today, Taizu's fourth uncle arrived in a carriage. Taizu's parents quickly welcomed him inside. The middle-aged man washed his face and hurriedly said, "Second brother, second sister-in-law, I can't stay long this time. I'm taking Taizhu and leaving. The Heng Yue sect will arrive to pick up the potential disciples tomorrow morning." Taizu's father was stunned. A trace of sadness appeared on his face. He firmly said, "Fine. Taizhu, follow your fourth uncle. If you are selected, study dutifully at the Heng Yue sect. However, if you aren't selected, don't worry and come back home." Taizhu, not wanting to leave his parents, nodded heavily. His mother took out a parcel from the room and lovingly said, "Taizhu, listen to your fourth uncle and don't cause any trouble. The outside is not the same as home, you must have patience. Mother has prepared you some new clothes. Also, there are some of your favorites, baked sweet potatoes. Mother will miss you. If you are not selected, just come back." As Taizu's mom was talking, tears began appearing in her eyes. Taizhu had never left the village in his entire life. This was his first time leaving. Fourth uncle emotionally said, "Taizhu, you must be selected so you make your parents proud. Second brother, second sister-in-law, the family will have a big celebration in a few days, so I am too busy today. Tomorrow, I'll pick you guys up. The results for the 3 candidates should be out by then." He quickly pulled Taizhu onto the carriage, whipped the horse, and set off. With tears in their eyes, Taizu's parents stared at the carriage as it quickly disappeared into the distance. Taizhu has never left home before. Will he be bullied? Taizu's mom said while biting her lip. Her eyes were filled with sadness. He has grown up and has to deal with his own fortune. Taizu's father picked up his pipe and inhaled deeply. More wrinkles appeared on his face. Chapter 2, Immortals. As the carriage quickly rolled along the road, Wang Lin's body bounced with the uneven ground. In his arms was the package that contained all of his parents' hopes. He was leaving the village he had lived in for 15 years. The trip wouldn't be a short one. Wang Lin lay down and fell asleep in the carriage. Not knowing how much time had passed, he was gently nudged. He opened his eyes to look up to see fourth uncle, who looked at him smiling and asked, "Taizhu, how do you feel about leaving home for the first time?" Wang Lin noticed that the carriage had stopped and smiled. "Not much to say, just a little anxious since I don't know if I will be selected by the immortals or not." Fourth uncle let out a laugh and patted Taizu's shoulder, saying, "Okay, don't overthink it. This is uncle's house. You go rest first, then I'll take you to the family tomorrow morning." When he climbed off the carriage, Wang Lin was in front of a tile-roofed house. He then followed fourth uncle to a room. Wang Lin sat on the bed, unable to sleep. The things his parents, village, and relatives said flashed through his mind. He signed in his heart. The thought of becoming the disciple of an immortal became heavier in his mind. Time passed by, bit by bit. A moment later, the sun gradually rose. Wang Lin didn't get much rest the whole night, but he was still full of energy. With a trace of fear, he followed fourth uncle to the main house of the Wang family. This was the first time Wang Lin had seen a house this big, leaving him in a daze. Fourth uncle said while walking, "Taizhu, you have to make your father proud. Don't let the relatives ridicule you." Wang Lin's mind became more tense. He bit his lips and nodded. Soon, fourth uncle brought him to the middle of the courtyard. Taizhu's father's eldest brother was standing there. When he saw Taizhu, he nodded and said, "Taizhu, when the immortal arrives, don't freak out, just follow your older brother Wang Chuo. Do everything he does." The old man's tone was very harsh on those last few words. Wang Lin stayed silent. He looked around and noticed that beside Wang Chuo, there was another youth. The youth's skin was a bit dark, his build was very large, and his eyes showed a hint of intelligence. There was a bulge in his shirt like he was hiding something. He looked at Taizhu and made a face, then ran over and said, "So you're second uncle's son. My name is Wang Hao." Wang Lin chuckled and nodded. When the old man saw Wang Lin ignoring him, he became very annoyed and was about to scold him. Right at this moment, the clouds in the sky suddenly split open. Then, a sword of light suddenly descended like lightning. After the light disappeared, there stood a youth in white whose eyes were bright and piercing, emitting an elegant spirit. His cold eyes swept across the three youths, especially at the youth with the bulge in his shirt. He asked coldly, "Are these three the ones recommended by the Wang family? This is an immortal." Under his gaze, Wang Lin started to feel cold. His heart pounded, and his face paled while staring at the immortal. The dark-skinned youth, upon seeing the immortal, placed his hands near the pockets of his pants, showing a respectful demeanor. His eyes held a fanatical expression. Only Wang Chuo casually looked at the others and snorted. Wang Chuo's father quickly stepped forward and respectfully said, "Immortal, these three are the Wang family's recommendations." The youth nodded and then impatiently said, "Who is Wang Chuo?" The old man's face showed a flash of happiness, then he quickly pulled Wang Chuo. "Immortal, this is my son, Wang Chuo." The immortal youth gave Wang Zhou a deep look. Then his face brightened, and he nodded. Wang Zhou is indeed talented, no wonder martial uncle took a liking to him. Wang Zhou proudly looked at Wang Lin and the smart-looking youth and proudly said, "This is natural. In order to become an immortal, one must have a strong spirit." The youth made a frown, but it quickly disappeared. He faintly smiled at Wang Chuo's direction, waved his sleeves, and took the three youths on the rainbow and disappeared. Fourth uncle looked into the sky and muttered, "Taizhu, you must be selected." Wang Lin felt his body lighten, and the wind hitting his face caused him pain. On closer inspection, he noticed that he was under the arm of the youth, and they were flying quickly through the sky. The village turned into little black dots as they quickly flew forward. After just a little, the wind caused his eyes to tear up and turn red. "Unless you three want to become blind, close your eyes," the youth said coldly. Wang Lin's heart tensed, and he quickly closed his eyes, afraid to keep looking. After a short period of time, Wang Lin could feel that the youth was short of breath, and his speed started decreasing. Then, in a flash, the youth quickly descended. The moment before landing, the youth loosened his arm, and the three youths fell to the ground. Thankfully, the fall wasn't hard, so the three got up quickly. In front of Wang Lin was a paradise-like scene with mountains, flowers, and a river. It was a truly idyllic scene. Straight ahead, stood a towering mountain, its peak covered in clouds that hid its true appearance. Echoes of beasts' cries could be heard. There was a path of twisted steps that snaked its way down the mountain, like a painting, evoking a feeling of a different world. Far off in the distance, there was a hall at the top of the mountain. Even though it was covered by the clouds, The shining bright light made people want to worship it. Next to the hall, there was a silver-colored bridge in the shape of a crescent moon connecting that peak with another mountain peak. With these natural beauties, this was truly worthy of being the location of the Heng Yue sect. The Heng Yue sect was one of the few cultivation sects in the country of Zhao. 500 years ago, it was the leading force of cultivation sects in the country of Zhao, and had several nascent soul-old monsters. However, with the passage of time, it had shrunken to its current size and was only able to barely have a foothold in the cultivation world. However, for the mortals near the Heng Yue sect, it was still an elusive figure. Little brother Jiang, are these the 3 candidates recommended by the Wang family? A middle-aged man dressed in black with an immortal demeanor floated down from the mountain peak. The youth showed a face full of respect and said, "Third brother, these are the Wang family's 3 recommended youths." The middle-aged man's gaze swept across them, focusing on Wang Zhou a few times. Smiling, he said, "I know you are about to have a breakthrough. I'll handle the test, you go cultivate." The youth agreed, and then his body moved toward the mountain and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. Wang Lin stared at the scene before him, full of excitement. Suddenly, he noticed someone tugging his clothes and turned around. It was Wang Hao. Eyes filled with excitement, he said, "This is where immortals live, damn it. No matter what, I, Wang Hao, must be selected." After saying so, he touched the bulging object concealed in his shirt. Chapter 3, Test. Wang Zhou was dazed by the scene before him. It took a long time for him to recover his senses, and the amount of arrogance in his heart shrank. At this moment, several rainbow-colored swords flew towards them. For each sword that dissipated, there was a Heng Yue sect disciple, each followed by several 15-year-olds. There were both male and female youths. As they landed, they, too, had similar expressions to Wang Lin's group as they stared at the scene in front of them. All the Heng Yue sect disciples that brought the youths gathered at the side and started talking about the youths. After waiting a while, all the other youths who had been recommended arrived at the sect. A black-clad middle-aged man scanned the area. Then he emotionlessly said, "Among the lot of you, only a few will be selected to be Heng Yue sect disciples." All of the youths cried out in shock. Wang Lin's heart shuddered. He counted a total of 48 people taking the test. Cultivation, the path to becoming an immortal, depends on your natural talent. The first test is to see whether or not your spirit is strong enough. Now, whoever I point to will come up and take the test. The middle-aged man emotionlessly pointed at a youth. The youth walked over carefully, his legs trembling. The middle-aged man put his hand on his head and said, "Not qualified. Stand to the left." The youth suddenly lost all strength. His face looked bleak, and his eyes were blank. He moved to the left in silence. Then another youth was selected. He moved forward with a fearful expression. "Not qualified. Not qualified. Not qualified." 10 people in a row all failed the test. Up until now, there was still no one to the right of the middle-aged man. It was Wang Chuo's turn. All of his previous pride disappeared from his face. Looking pale, he stepped forward. After the middle-aged man put his hand on Wang Chuo's head, his face suddenly lit up, and he asked, "What is your name?" Wang Chuo quickly replied respectfully, "Immortal, my name is Wang Chuo." The middle-aged man nodded. He then smiled and said, "So you are the one martial teacher mentioned. Good. Wang Chuo, stand to the right." Wang Chuo felt exaltation and walked toward the right under everyone's admiration. His eyes were filled with arrogance and contempt as he looked at the crowd. He felt untouchable. "Motherfucker, he is one lucky dog, Wang Hao murmured to Wang Lin while curling his lip. Wang Lin's heart became more tense. In front of his eyes rose his parents' eyes filled with expectations. He tightened his fists. "Not bad, you also stand to the right," said the middle-aged man, surprised, to the young girl in front of him. After a short period of time, almost all the youths had been tested, and only 2 stood to the right of the middle-aged man. Wang Hao was up next. Wang Hao quickly ran up to the middle-aged man. Before he could even start the test, he knelt to the ground and kowtowed a few times. He said, "Immortal, may you enjoy a long life. My name is Wang Hao. You have already tested so many people, so you must be tired. Why don't you rest for a while? I'm in no rush, it's no problem." The middle-aged man laughed out loud. He had tested so many people whose faces were filled with fear, yet this clever youth here, without the slightest bit of fear, was trying to win favor with him. He pressed his hand on Wang Hao's head and said, "Talent is lacking." Not. The moment Wang Hao heard that his spirit was lacking, his heart plummeted. Without waiting for the middle-aged man to finish, he quickly took out a jade box and presented it in front of him. Wang Hao wisely said, "Immortal, my father found this by accident in the mountain but was unable to open it. I specially brought it to give to Immortal." The middle-aged man chuckled and shook his head. He was about to refuse Wang Hao, but as he scanned the box, his pupils suddenly contracted, and his face suddenly lit up. "Not bad. This is at least a 300-year-old mushroom." Looking at the jade box, it was sealed by a cultivator. "No wonder your father couldn't open it." He paused, then said with a slightly faltering voice, "I'm in need of a helper for my alchemy. Are you willing to be my helper?" Wang Hao, surprised, got up quickly. The difference in treatment was like heaven and earth, causing him to be very excited. He exclaimed, "Yes, Immortal, I am willing." The middle-aged man said while chuckling, "Since you'll be my helper, I won't mistreat you. You can cultivate just like the other disciples. Go stand to the right." Wang Hao was very excited inside. He ran to the right side and gave Wang Chuo a triumphant stare. The faces of all the youths who failed turned pale. All of them felt very depressed. A few even started crying. The middle-aged man frowned. He shouted, "Send away all those who started crying." A few of the Heng Yue sect disciples stepped out. They quickly took the ones that started crying and casually disappeared in swords of light. The middle-aged man pointed at Wang Lin. Wang Lin took a deep breath. He nervously walked toward the side of the middle-aged man, his mind completely blank. Praying silently in his heart, he couldn't help but remember the expectation in his parents' eyes. "I will definitely be selected." Wang Lin thought with determination. The middle-aged man's hand pressed on his head. With a deadpan face, he said the 2 words Wang Lin dreaded the most. "Not qualified." Wang Lin didn't remember how he made it to the left side, he only heard the spring thunder roaring in his ears and the echoing of the 2 words the middle-aged man said. After a moment, everyone had been tested, and only 3 people stood to the right. In the eyes of everyone else, the 3 were insurmountable and immensely tall. Wang Chuo looked at Wang Lin with a face full of contempt, fully expressing his disdain for him. While a strong spirit is needed to be a cultivator, perseverance is even more important. Even ordinary students like you can become sect disciples if you have enough perseverance. The second test is perseverance. The middle-aged man paused, then said with a deadpan face, "Follow the steps up. If you reach the top, you are qualified. If you're not finished within 3 days you fail. Those who fail will be returned to their families. If you cannot endure any longer or meet danger, just yell out loud, and someone will come and save you." The middle-aged man smiled at the 3 on his right and said, "You too, follow me to meet the patriarch. We will also find you masters. Wang Hao, you don't need to go, come with me to the alchemy house to get used to the place. After the middle-aged man finished giving instructions, he took the 3 selected youths and disappeared into the mountains. Wang Lin took a deep breath, eyes full of determination. He walked up the stone steps with no hesitation and started the test of perseverance. Minus the 3 selected youths and the 6 crying youths who were taken away, 39 remained. Among these 39 youths, the very depressed ones, the very determined ones, and those who were scared all walked toward their own futures. Chapter 4, Heartless. The uneven stone steps were very dangerous on both sides. The slightest mistake would cause one to slip and fall. After less than half a day, Wang Lin's legs felt like they were made of lead. He was sweaty and out of breath, it was difficult to even move. Looking up from the bottom of the mountain, the trail didn't seem long, but now, this trail felt like it had no end. Wang Lin's heart sank. He could not help but generate thoughts of despair. In front of him, there were a dozen physically strong boys, slowly climbing. They were all also out of breath. Until now, no one had given up. Wang Lin gritted his teeth. He knew this was his last chance. His parents' expectations filled his mind. At that very moment, the foot of a boy behind him slipped. The boy fell off the side of the mountain with a scream. I give up. Help. Everybody stopped to look down at the same time and saw a dark light flashing by. A Heng Yue sect disciple appeared out of nowhere and grabbed the boy. Their bodies could be seen gently falling to the foot of the mountain. Wang Lin was pale and silent. He carefully continued climbing upwards. Time seemed to be passing much more slowly. 2 days later, he could see the shadows of the dozens of youths in front of him. Wang Lin didn't know how many of these companions would give up, he only knew that he must not give up. His feet were bleeding and swelling. He felt a terrible tingling every step he took. He still persisted and used his hands to climb. A middle-aged man with a sickly complexion floated down the stairs from the top of the mountain. Little children, keep your hearts strong, for this path is ruthless. It won't be in vain, nothing is in vain. He let out a lengthy sigh as he floated down past the climbing youths. The middle-aged man passed Wang Lin. This was the 6th youth he passed by, and he was the most pathetic of the bunch. With clothes soaked with blood, he seemed to be bleeding everywhere. His knees and toes were mangled. Wang Lin was climbing using his hands at this point. The middle-aged man sighed loudly and asked, "My child, what is your name?" Wang Lin's vision was blurry. The only thought in his head was to reach the top or die. He didn't even hear the middle-aged man's question. In his eyes, this little trail was the only thing that mattered. The middle-aged man looked at Wang Lin's eyes. Deep down, he was rather moved. He put his hand on Wang Lin's head. This boy has amazing perseverance. It's too bad he lacks talent. What a waste, what a waste. He gave Wang Lin a deep look, then continued to descend the steps. The next night, Wang Lin's hands were bloody. He left a trail of blood as he climbed the stairs. He did not know how he kept going, but something kept fueling his body to go on. He felt like he could die at any time. The sun rose on the 3rd day. In the distance, Wang Lin could just barely make out the end of the stone steps. Unfortunately, with the end in sight, he heard a thunderous voice that shook his heart. Time is up. Only 3 have qualified. The rest failed? Wang Lin let out a small, bitter laugh. He looked down while his body was slanting down on the stairs. His consciousness completely faded. The black-clad middle-aged man from 3 days ago stood on top of the mountain. He was looking at Wang Lin from less than 50 meters away with a ruthless look in his eyes. A few Heng Yue sect disciples went down from the top of the mountain. They each stopped next to one of the youths on the way down and fed them medicine. A female Heng Yue sect disciple said in a cold voice, "Seniors, out of 39 testers, 25 gave up. Only 3 passed the test, and 11 remain." She had also experienced this brutal test. She relied on the martial arts she had practiced since she was a child to pass. She barely had enough perseverance. Even now, after 10 years of effort, she still hadn't become a true disciple. The black-clad middle-aged man had an icy look in his eyes. He slightly nodded while his eyes swept past the 11 unconscious teenagers. "Take the 3 that qualified and find work for them to do in the future. Send the 25 that gave up back to their families. As for the last 11 people, wait for them to wake up. Send them together to the House of the Sword Spirit to see if any of them have spiritual affinity with the Sword Spirit. If they don't, send them home." After the middle-aged man was finished here, he walked away without another glance at the youths below. 3 days later, at the House of the Sword Spirit, stood 11 teenagers with pale faces. The injuries all over Wang Lin's body were already healed, but the wound in his heart was still gaping open. The pain of his failure kept eating away at his mind and body. This test of the spirit of the sword was conducted not by the black-clad middle-aged man but by a man wearing white, someone they hadn't seen before. He had the same cold, ruthless look in his eyes. He looked at the youths as if they were ants. The man said, with an impatient look, "This is the last test. If you can walk into this room, you are qualified." All Wang Lin saw was an extremely common building. The front door of the building was open. When he looked inside, he could see swords of different lengths. Each of the youths, one by one, walked towards the house. The first one that approached got within 5 meters of the house. His face went red as he struggled to get closer but was expelled by an invisible force. "Unqualified." "Next," said the man in white. Wang Lin was the 7th in line. The 6 before him all met the same fate, expelled by an invisible force when they got within 5 meters of the house. He smiled bitterly and, with the last bit of hope in his heart, stepped forward. As he approached the 5-meter mark, Wang Lin was able to keep going with ease. His heart was beating rapidly with anticipation. He stepped closer, 1 meter more. He wasn't feeling any discomfort yet. The white-clothed man let out a surprised hey. His eyes were bright, and his face showed slight interest. He gently said, "Don't hesitate to continue. Keep walking towards the House of the Spirit of the Sword. If you are recognized by the Spirit of the Sword, you will be accepted as a true disciple, even if you failed the 2 previous tests." The 10 other teenagers standing there had the color of envy in their faces. They were deeply jealous of Wang Lin. Wang Lin was very tense on the inside. The looks his parents gave him flashed through his mind again, as he stepped 1 meter closer to the door. There were only 3 meters remaining to reach the door. Wang Lin took another step. He suddenly felt a huge force rush in his direction. Wang Lin lost control of his body and was sent flying more than 10 meters away. The rest of the youths all looked at Wang Lin with mocking expressions in their eyes. They thought that Wang Lin was just like them after all, with no chance. With a bitter laugh, Wang Lin could feel the gaping wounds in his heart grow bigger. His parents' expectant eyes gradually dissipated from his mind. The man in white's eyes turned cold again, and he said, "Failed. Next." Chapter 5, The Return. In the end, none of the 11 youths passed the test. There was one young girl who made it as far as Wang Lin. On that day, all of the youths that failed the test were sent back to the bottom of the mountain. The Heng Yue sect disciples took them home one by one. The one that came to take Wang Lin home was the same youth that had picked him up. Behind him was Wang Chuo and Wang Hao. The youth clasped his hands and said, "Brother Wang Chuo, congratulations on becoming Uncle Master's disciple. You have a bright future ahead of you." Wang Chuo's face showed an arrogant expression. He proudly said, "It is only natural. Master said that after I have finished taking care of the mundane affairs at home, he will teach me cultivator techniques after I return." Wang Hao raised his head and added on the side, "I have always looked down on your arrogant demeanor. So, what if you have a master? I will be able to learn how to produce immortal pills." Wang Chuo gave Wang Hao a hard stare, then he shifted his gaze to Wang Lin, who silently stood there. He smiled and said, "Taizhu, how was it? I told you before that you didn't have the ability, but you and your father wouldn't believe it. Now we know the result." Taizhu raised his head, glanced slightly at Wang Chuo, and said, "Sir, my parents are waiting for me at home. Please take me back as soon as possible." Wang Chuo saw Wang Lin dare to ignore him and sneered. "Little bumpkin, you are better off becoming a carpenter in a little village for the rest of your life, like your father." The immortal youth let out a faint smile as he looked at the three youths in front of him but didn't say a single word. He waved his sleeves and brought the three along as they disappeared from the Heng Yue sect mountain. Comparing this flight to the last one, Wang Lin's mood was like heaven and earth. Before, he was full of hope, but now, he was full of despair. A little while later, the Wang clan's house came into view. Wang Lin opened his eyes. He could see from afar the clan house that was lit up in celebration with a lively atmosphere. There were far more banquet tables than when his father had organized the feast at the village. They covered almost the whole yard. All the Wang family members were there. Even those who were away buying lumber had come back. The celebration was in full swing, full of drinking and chatter. The lead of the banquet was Wang Tianshui's older brother, Wang Tianshui, and Wang Tianshui's third brother. All the relatives surrounded the three of them to give them their congratulations. The scene was very festive. Their eyes were filled with envy, but their mouths were full of flattery, especially towards Wang Lin's father, who couldn't help but remember the sadness from his past. Wang Lin's sixth uncle exclaimed, "Second brother, this time, your son will be selected for sure. After this, you don't have to be a carpenter anymore. Anyone who sees you will have no choice but to call you elder." Wang Tianshui's fifth uncle said, "Lao back in the days, I already knew your life wouldn't be normal. You devoted your life to Taizhu. Now that he is going to be an immortal, you as his father must be extraordinary. Second brother, this time both your kid Taizhu and my son will be selected. We brothers haven't met each other in 10 years. This time, we must have a drink together, no matter what," said Wang Hao's father as he brought over glasses of wine. He was also Wang Tianshui's third brother. Taizu's father looked at all the relatives that used to look down on him. All the sorrow from his past was swept away. However, he couldn't help but feel a giant rock weighing down his heart. "Taizhu, you must be selected. Second sister-in-law, this time your marriage to second brother has brought you good fortune. Having Taizhu as your child, who in the neighboring area won't know you. Second sister-in-law, your kid Taizhu has more ability than my child. Ever since Taizhu was little, he has been very smart. Taizu's mother, even though we are of the same family, there are many consanguine relatives who have married nowadays. My daughter is unmarried and is about the same age as Taizhu. Taizhu is handsome, and I like him. Why don't we tie the knot between our families?" Like Taizu's father, his mother was surrounded by a group of female relatives who were enthusiastically chattering beside her. Wang Zhao's father held an indifferent look the whole time. He secretly desired for the immortal to come and deliver the news that Taizhu had not been selected so he could see his second brother's reaction to it. As he thought of this, he let out a laugh and toasted the relative next to him that was praising his child. The scene was bustling and full of spirit. At that moment, a sword of light appeared and landed in the courtyard. 4 people came with it. The area immediately quieted down. No member of the Wang family dared to say a word. The Heng Yue sect disciple swept across the area and secretly sighed. He remembered when he was selected as a Heng Yue sect disciple. His hometown was celebrating like this as well. He suddenly gives Wang Lin a look of pity. He knew that the thing that this youth was about to experience wasn't something a youth could handle. He has a ruthless path ahead of him. The disciple shook his head and left in a sword of light. Immortal practitioners can't have any earthly desires. Take care of what you need to. I'll come pick you up in 3 days. His voice echoed from the distance. When Wang Chuo's father saw the immortal leave, he quickly rushed up to his son and asked, "Did immortal Hui Bing take you as his disciple?" Wang Chuo said, with a face full of pride and arrogance, "Naturally. Master has said that in 10 years, I'll be able to become the head of Heng Yue sect disciples." Wang Chuo's father was overjoyed. He patted his son heavily on the shoulders and laughed. "Good, Wang Chuo, you will be an immortal in the future. Our Wang family will have an immortal." Wang Hao's father's face also had an anxious expression while staring at Wang Hao. When he was about to ask, Wang Hao let out a sigh and said, "Dad, you don't have to ask. Your son is already a Heng Yue sect disciple." Wang Hao's father was ecstatic. He picked up his cup and fiercely drank. Wang Chuo had a disgusted look on his face. He said contemptuously, "Third uncle, you gave birth to a good son. He has lost the Wang family a lot of face." In front of everyone, he flattered the immortal, and then, only relying on a bribe, was he able to become a helper. Wang Hao raised his brow and said, "I'm happy. So what? In the future, let us see who has stronger cultivator techniques, and then we will see who has lost the family face." Taizu's father saw the depressed expression his son wore, causing his body to shudder. He had an ominous feeling. "Taizu, what about you?" Taizu's mother asked, full of expectation. Chapter 6, Insults. Taizu was silent as Wang Chuo, in a derisive tone, said, "I have said before that this kid didn't have any talent. All he did was go and lose face for our family. I passed on the first test, so I didn't see him until later on. A few days later, I heard that he failed all 3 tests. He might as well not have gone. I would have preferred it if 4th uncle's son had gone instead." Taizu's 4th uncle frowned and said, "Wang Chuo, even if you're going to become an immortal, what can you possibly know about what my son can or can't do?" The audacity. There was a flash of coldness in Wang Chuo's eyes. He quietly laughed but didn't say anything. Taizu's father suddenly looked like he had aged more than 10 years and fell down to his seat. Taizu's mother was also shocked. She couldn't believe what was happening. She asked, "Taizu, is this true?" Taizu bit his lip until it started bleeding. He fell to the ground and kowtowed a few times. He whispered, "Mom, Dad, Taizu wasn't selected by the immortals. I'm sorry, I will repay you both in the next life." Taizu's mother realized her son was in despair. She quickly ran and helped Taizu to his feet. She whispered, "Child, don't worry. So, what if you weren't selected by the immortals? Next year there is the district exam. Child, don't be so hard on yourself. Don't do anything stupid, either. Your father and mother still expect you to be at our funerals." Taizu's father snapped out of his daze. He realized the kind of mental state Taizhu was in. His heart trembled, and he quickly ran up to his son. Holding him, he nervously said, "Taizhu, you better not do anything stupid. Listen to your dad. Let's go home and study hard for next year's district exam." The surrounding relatives quickly moved away from Taizhu's family. They all gathered around as if they were watching a show, gossiping and sharing comments about the event unfolding before them. Taizhu's sixth uncle quipped, "I always knew that this Taizhu kid didn't have any talent. How could he compare to Wang Chuo? Totally right. Since this was bound to happen, why act like he was already accepted? How shameful. Lao you are this old already. How could you still do something so stupid? No wonder Dad didn't give you a share of the inheritance back then," said Taizhu's third uncle sarcastically. "If you ask me, the story that this kid has always been smart, since he was a child, was fabricated. It was probably because Lao knew that he himself was a failure. He tried to raise his son's reputation by lying, and now he's been exposed," said Taizhu's fifth uncle, whose face had turned ugly. A female relative scoffed, "Out of the 3 children that went to test, only he failed. Taizhu is the worst child in our Wang family. Second sister-in-law, I earlier said you had good fortune with second brother. Now it seems like your luck will keep dwindling for the rest of your life." Taizhu's fifth aunt also sneered, "Isn't that right? When I went to see Taizhu a few days ago, I was wondering how he could compare to Wang Hao and Wang Chuo at all." Another female relative mercilessly said, "I had already seen that kid Taizhu didn't have any talent. Just look at his mom and dad. How could they give birth to anyone good? In our Wang family, only eldest brother and third brother's kids are any good. Taizhu, just with that name, he sounds like an idiot. I was totally blind back then, about to push my daughter into a pit of fire. Good thing we found out beforehand that Taizhu wasn't selected by the immortals. My daughter would have hated me forever if I had her marry him. Taizhu's mom, let us forget about this whole thing. Since your Taizhu won't become an immortal, who would want their daughter to marry him? Isn't that like a toad wanting a swan's meat?" In a few moments, all the relatives turned into snobs. They continuously launched a barrage of insults at Taizhu's family. Compared to the previous scene, it was like heaven and earth. There were even relatives who went as far as to ask for the gifts they gave back. Seeing his parents' pale faces, Taizhu tightened his fist. Listening to all the insults left him wishing he was dead. Wang Chuo's father laughed inwardly and sneered, "Lao didn't I tell you that to become an immortal's disciple, you need fate on your side? How could there possibly be any chance unless you have talent like my son? Yet you seriously believed it would be possible. Now you made your son wish he was dead. Was there a need for this?" Taizhu's father couldn't hold in his anger any longer. He shouted, "Wang Qianshan, shut your mouth. Back in the day, father, on his deathbed left me a part of the inheritance. You worked with the other relatives to steal it away from me, and now you are here insulting me. Do you really think I, Wang Tianshui, will quietly endure this? And all of you people as well. Earlier, you were happily congratulating me, and now you are here insulting us. Our son is already in this state, yet you add insult to injury. Are you all still human?" Wang Qianshan paused for a moment and said, "Why bring up the past? I warned you with good intentions that your son didn't have any talent, but here you are being angry at me. Humph, with a dad like you, the son won't be much better." All the insults thrown at the crestfallen Wang Lin were like thorns piercing his heart. He coldly looked at everyone and engraved their faces into his heart. I'll fight you to the death." Taizhu's father couldn't hold in his anger any longer and picked up a chair. Taizu's fourth uncle rushed up and stopped him, whispering, "Brother, don't be impulsive. Elder brother has many servants. Listen to me, don't bother with him." Taizu's fourth uncle glared at Wang Qianshan and said, "Eldest brother, is that any way to talk? I will not listen to this any longer. If you dare to keep insulting my second brother, don't blame me for not caring about family ties. While the Wang family is big, I have made many friends during my travel. Don't push me to burn it all." Wang Qianshan murmured a few words. He still feared the well-connected fourth brother. "Lao Si, what you are saying is unreasonable. We aren't wrong in pointing out that Lao Yi's son doesn't have any talent. What's wrong with us, the older generation, scolding the younger? What you're saying is too unreasonable," said the family's third eldest uncle with discontent. Chapter 7, Leaving Home. "That's right. Fourth brother, we are speaking for you because you gave your spot to second brother. What Wang Chuo said was correct, your son is stronger than Taiju. He might have really gotten selected by the immortals." Taizu's fifth brother added on the side. Wang Chuo, with a proud smile, gloated, "Their family brought all this upon themselves. My father and I warned them beforehand. This useless family is about as stubborn as a donkey. Now they hit a wall." Wang Hao, with a pale face, said, "Taiju, he." Before he could finish, Wang Hao's father shot him a fierce look. He lost all confidence and kept quiet afterward. Taizu's fourth uncle let out a deep sigh and said, "Whoever brings this up again means he has something against me, let this be done." Taiju not being selected can only be said that he wasn't fortunate enough and nothing else. "Taiju, don't take it to heart, you can come to your fourth uncle for anything. I have no say in immortal sects, but when it comes to normal sects, your uncle still has some ability to get in you. You can go with my son, Huzi. I have always planned to send him to a sect to train." Wang Chuo chuckled when he heard that. He scornfully said, "Taiju, I say go with fourth uncle. When you get there, you can tell them you were the trash that was rejected by the immortals. They might really take you." Wang Lin slowly raised his head. He looked around, glaring at all the surrounding relatives. When his eyes finally landed on Wang Chuo, he said, "Wang Chuo, mark my words. I, Wang Lin, will definitely enter an immortal school. I'll also never forget how you and your father insulted my family." Wang Chuo laughed when he heard Taizu's words, but before he could say anything else, fourth uncle shouted at Wang Chuo, "You wordy little brat. I'm going to waste you right now. Let's see if the immortals still want you then." Wang Chuo's father suddenly looked pale. He hurriedly stepped in front of Wang Chuo. "Fourth brother, you wouldn't dare." The surrounding relatives all held a cold smile on their faces as they watched the events unfold in front of them. Taizu's fourth uncle laughed. He had a steely look in his eyes. In a low, deep voice, he said, "Really, brother? I wouldn't dare." Taizu's father quickly stepped forward to pull his fourth brother back. "Fourth brother, listen to your second brother. You have a wife and kids at home, acting like this isn't worth it for you. I will forever remember what you have done for me, just bring my family home." Fourth uncle glared at Wang Chuo's father. He then nodded at his second brother and proceeded to leave the house with Taiju and his family. Even from afar, Wang Lin could hear the relatives in the yard mocking him and his family. The family sat in fourth uncle's carriage as he gave them a ride home. Silence enveloped the inside of the carriage. Taizu's father quietly sighed. It'd be false to say that he wasn't disappointed, but Taiju was still his son. He finally broke the silence. "Taiju, this is nothing, all right. When I was forced out of the house before, I was much more despondent than you, yet I still persevered. Listen to your father. Go home and study. Strive towards a good result in next year's district exam. If you don't feel like reading, go relax with your fourth uncle. Taizu's mother gave her son a loving look and consoled him. Taizhu, don't do anything stupid. You're my only son. If anything happens to you, I wouldn't want to live anymore. You have to be strong. As she was talking, tears rolled down her face. Wang Lin looked at his parents. He nodded and said, "Father, Mother, rest assured. I will not do anything silly. Don't worry, I have a plan." Taizu's mother embraced him. While holding him in her arms she said, "Taizhu, it's over. We will forget about this matter." In his mother's warm embrace, Taizu's wounded heart was slowly healing. He felt exhausted after the events of the last few days. As the carriage bounced up and down, Taizhu slowly drifted into sleep. He saw a dream. He dreamt that he was an immortal, flying in the sky with his parents. When Taizhu woke up, it was late at night. He sighed lightly as he looked around at the familiar room. His heart was resolute. Before he left the house, he took a long, deep look at his sleeping parents. He picked up a pen and paper and wrote a letter. After taking enough dry food, he was on his way. I will not give up on the path to becoming an immortal. I must try to join Heng Yue's sect one more time. If they still won't accept me, I must at least find the location of other immortal sects. Wang Lin's eyes were filled with resolve, as he left the mountain village, carrying only a bag. With the moonlight paving the road and stars marking his direction, Wang Lin made his way forward, only his long shadow for company. 3 days have passed. Wang Lin was walking on a remote mountain road. He had opened his eyes back when the young immortal was holding him. He could still recall the general direction. Heading east, Wang Lin ignored the weeds that were cutting both his legs. He kept moving forward. After a week, he had already entered the inner parts of the mountains. Fortunately, there were no man-eating beasts here. Wang Lin pursued his path carefully. Today, when he looked up, he was finally able to see the familiar misty peaks on an isolated hilltop. Taizhu was completely exhausted at this point. He took out some dried food and took a few bites while staring at the Heng Yue sect's entrance. The hairs on the back of Wang Lin's neck stood up as he heard a wild animal breathing behind him. He looked back, and all the color instantly drained from his face. A large white tiger with blood-red eyes made the air feel dense. Drops of saliva dripped out of the corner of its mouth, producing dripping sounds as they hit the ground. The white tiger roared as it pounced. Wang Lin revealed a bitter smile and, without hesitation, jumped off the side of a cliff. He felt the wind on his face as he plummeted down. He couldn't help but remember the looks in his parents' eyes, as well as all the relatives that taunted him. Father, Mother, your son didn't listen to you. This is goodbye. The wall of the cliff was covered in a myriad of branches. Taizu's body was getting cut by the branches as he dropped at breakneck speed. A few moments later, in the middle of the drop, Taizhu felt an enormous force pulling him. Wang Lin had no control of his body as the force pulled him. Before he knew it, he was inside a cave that had been carved onto the wall of the cliff. He felt a great force constantly pulling his body against the wall. After a long time, the force finally disappeared, and he fell down from the wall. It took him a long time to regain his senses. As Taizhu struggled to get back up, he noticed his clothes were torn, and his body had gotten scraped all over by the branches. Pain came flooding in from his swollen right arm. Large drops of sweat streamed down, sticking to every part of his body. Wang Lin touched his arm, but he couldn't tell if the bones were broken. This injury was definitely sustained when he hit the wall. Chapter 8, Stone Bead. Taiju was pale as he got up and looked around. He found that he was in a small natural cave. The sunlight peered in through the entrance of the cave, revealing a floor covered with the bones of birds and animals. On the wall behind him was a black hole the size of a fist. He couldn't tell how deep this little hole was, but on closer inspection, one mystery was solved. The pulling force that sucked him into the cave earlier came from this hole. The animals that those tattered bones had belonged to were sucked in just like he had been. The suction from the hole must be spontaneous. The moment he appeared in front of this cave during his fall, the mysterious hole pulled him in and saved his life. Taiju, enduring the agony of his right arm, was about to walk out of the cave when the bones on the ground suddenly started moving toward the hole. He quickly rolled to the corner of the cave without a moment's delay as he felt the wind behind him. The unimaginable sucking force suddenly came from the little hole. All the bones rattled as they flew toward the hole. Some of the bigger bones were stuck on the wall, blocking the little hole. At that moment, a bird was sucked in as it flew by the cave's entrance. It whizzed through the air until it splattered against the cave wall. After about an hour, the force stopped pulling. Wang Lin stared in horror at the corpse of the recently deceased bird. He didn't move his body at all, he only sat still while calculating the time. Half an hour later, the suction started again. This repeated several times. Wang Lin had grasped the timing of the strange suctioning hole. It would start sucking every 30 minutes for a duration of 60 minutes. Taking advantage of the time gap between suctions, Wang Lin painfully crept towards the cave entrance. As he looked below, he couldn't help but reveal a bitter smile. Below him was a jungle, and the barely visible ground was covered with rocks. The cliff was very steep. There was no way for him to climb down with his broken arm. The distance from the ground measured more than a few dozen meters. If he tried to jump down, it would definitely be the end. The bag filled with food was left at the top of the mountain with no way for him to retrieve it. Right now, food was the most important problem he needed to solve. As he was pondering, he suddenly remembered the suction time and rushed back to the corner of the cave. Time in the outside world seemed to pass by quickly. Wang Lin could feel his body grow weaker and weaker. He had no feeling in his arm, it was completely numb. He smiled bitterly as he said to himself, being stuck here means a slow death, but jumping down would be instant death. He looked at the bloody corpse of the bird that was sucked in earlier. With a bit of hesitation, he walked over, picked it up, and reluctantly took a bite. The taste was appalling. He exhaled as the raw meat in his mouth flooded his senses, but then he continued to eat it. He barely chewed the meat, opting to just swallow it nearly whole. Taiju felt warmth enter his stomach as it churned. He ate the bird quickly in big bites, and then he stood up and took a deep breath to keep himself from puking it all out. He tossed the remains of the bird to the side and sat down against the cave wall. His mind wandered, one moment thinking about his parents, one moment thinking of his fourth uncle, one moment thinking about the mocking faces of his relatives, and one moment he even thought about the cold eyes of the middle-aged man in black from the Heng Yue sect. In a trance, Wang Lin looked at the half-eaten bird corpse. Without batting an eye, he picked up the corpse for a closer inspection. He saw that within the bird's corpse, there was a red bead the size of a baby's fist. He was very surprised as he took it out of the carcass. Why was there a bead in this bird's body? Wang Lin's heart was pounding as he thought of a book the teacher in his village had once shown him. Some animals live to be much older, and something called a dantian will form within their body. If one were to eat a dantian, their life would be prolonged, and their strength would increase. Even limbs that had been cut off would grow back. When he saw that description, he didn't believe it and secretly scoffed at it, but now he couldn't help but believe in myths and legends a little more after meeting immortals. Wang Lin's heart was pounding hard enough to fly out of his chest. If this bead was really the dantian described in the book, then eating it would not only heal his injuries quickly, but it would also make it easy to leave this place. Even passing the test to join the Heng Yue sect should be possible, at least he would be able to pass the perseverance test. But the bead was very hard. It didn't seem edible. He used some of the ragged cloth on his body to wipe it clean, restoring its original color. A grey bead with 5 clouds carved on it was revealed. It looked very old. Wang Lin was very disappointed. Unwilling to give up, he gave the bead a bite, then silently laughed at himself. Taizhu, you are too delusional. How could some random bird that just happened to fly by have a dantian? Wang Lin sighed. It was already dark outside. He felt weary and fell asleep with the bead by his side and animal bones covering the floor. Since it is fall right now, the temperature dropped very quickly, especially in the mountain area. The cold air entered Wang Lin's body. He curled up, and the night passed by quickly. The next morning, sunlight peered in from the outside of the cave as the sun rose. A few drops of sparkling dew secreted from the bead by Wang Lin's side. As the dew gathered, it dripped onto the bones nearby. After a while, Wang Lin woke up. Not only was his arm still swollen, but its condition seemed to have gotten worse. Wang Lin sat on the floor, feeling very depressed. Wang Lin muttered to himself, "Am I going to be stuck here my whole life?" He slowly turned his head and noticed the dew that accumulated on the bones. Since he was thirsty, he carefully picked up a few bones and licked the dew off them. The sweetness of the dew was quite good. He couldn't tell if he was imagining it, but his whole body felt warm and comfortable after drinking some. Especially the injury on his arm. There was a feeling of comfort and itching as the swelling lessened. Wang Lin rubbed his eyes and closely looked at his arm. The swelling had indeed gone down. He quickly looked at the bones around him but wasn't able to find any more with dew on them. At that moment, he suddenly noticed the bead and saw drops of dew on it. He remembered that all the bones that had dew on them were next to the bead. He gently picked up the bead, with his heart pounding, and rolled the bead on his arm to evenly spread out the dew. Waves of cool and refreshing feelings came from the arm. Wang Lin stared at his arm without batting an eye. After a while, his eyes lit up. The swelling from the arm had gone down. He tried waving his arm. While there was still some pain, it wasn't a big deal. This stone bead must be a treasure. Wang Lin was pleasantly surprised. Chapter 9, Down the Cliff. For the next few days, Wang Lin relied on the birds that were sucked into the cave and splattered on the wall for food. He spent most of his time carefully observing the stone bead. Every time dew appeared, he would smear it on his arm. He did this until his arm was fully recovered. He knew this dew was extremely valuable, so he collected some in the skull of a bird. On this day, he sprinkled the dew he had been collecting throughout the past few days on a piece of cloth and carefully wrapped the bead in it. After making sure it wouldn't fall off, he arrived at the entrance to the cave when the suction force stopped. He used his teeth to tear apart his clothes and tied them together, then tied one end to a rock and the other around his waist and slowly climbed down. Wang Lin had climbed down about 5 or 6 meters when his hand slipped. His body dropped quickly, but luckily his clothes were tough and gave him time to swing toward the cliff and grab onto a branch before the cloth tore. Cold sweat glistened on Wang Lin's forehead. When he looked down, he estimated that he was still 20 meters up. With one hand, he grabbed a branch, and with the other hand, he grabbed the cloth and tied the cloth to the branch. Only then did he feel relieved. He carefully moved back toward the cliff edge and then started to descend again. When he was 10 meters from the ground, the cloth had stretched to its limit. Wang Lin jumped down without a second thought. His clothes couldn't bear the weight and began to split apart, but still helped lighten the fall. Wang Lin felt the wind caress his face on the way down, as well as branches breaking under him, slowing down his fall. He positioned his body just right as he landed, toes pointing downward, and rolled into a ball as he touched the ground. The ground felt like a stone knife that pierced his body, creating various deep cuts, especially a cut on his leg. It was so deep that you could see the bones. Wang Lin, with blurry vision, gasped for breath. He struggled to put the cloth that was around his neck that contained the bead into his mouth and sucked some dew that was in the cloth. After a while, he struggled to sit up and, with trembling hands, took the cloth and squeezed it above the wound on his leg as a few drops of dew came out. A cool feeling emitted from the place the wound was. After having done all this, Wang Lin fell to the ground and prayed for no beasts to attack him before he recovered. At that moment, he heard a shout from a distance. "Taizhu, where are you?" Wang Lin was stunned. He listened closely and realized that it was his dad's voice. Without time to think, he used all the strength left in his body to shout, "Dad! I'm here!" A rainbow approached from the distance. It circled around the cliff near Wang Lin for a while, then descended. A sword of light came down and dissipated, revealing a Heng Yue sect disciple with Wang Lin's father in his arm, frowning at Wang Lin. When Taizu's father saw his son, he immediately burst into tears. He ran up to Wang Lin and hugged him. While crying, he said, "Taizhu, what were you thinking? Why did you have to be so stubborn? Have you ever thought about how your parents would live if you died?" Wang Lin was stunned. After thinking about it, he realized his dad misunderstood and thought that he was trying to commit suicide. After looking at himself and seeing how battered his body was, he couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. The Heng Yue sect disciple, surnamed Zhang, gazed over Wang Lin. He looked to the cliff above and saw the clothes that had been torn earlier. With a few leaps, he climbed up until he reached the cave. He felt a force try to suck him in and showed a surprised expression. However, he quickly recovered and jumped down like the force was no big deal. He said lowly, "Your kid wanted to commit suicide but was saved by this natural suction force from the cave. Now that Wang Lin has been found, let's go back to the sect and have the elder make a decision." The Heng Yue sect disciple rolled his sleeves, grabbed the father-son duo, and quickly left that place. After a while, they arrived at the foot of the mountain of the Heng Yue sect, then climbed the steps and approached the peak. Coming back here like this caused Wang Lin to have mixed feelings. At the peak, there were many people with ugly expressions. The disciple Zhang quickly went up to one of them and whispered something. The old man's brow wrinkled, and he said in a cold voice, "Since the person was found, send him to the guest room to reunite him with his mother." In the room, when Wang Lin's mother saw her son, she immediately burst into tears and ran up to hug him. After hearing from his parents, he finally knew what was going on. When he ran away from home, his parents returned to the Wang family to find his fourth uncle. The three of them feared for his safety, so they went to find Wang Chuo's father. With the pressure of his fourth uncle, Wang Chuo's father reluctantly got the family members to help ask the Heng Yue sect to help. This is the first time the Heng Yue sect has encountered something like this and opted to ignore it at first. However, the reason why Wang Lin ran away from home was due to not being accepted into the Heng Yue sect. Although the Heng Yue sect didn't care about the life and death of a mortal, if he were really to die and the news of it spread to the villages nearby, parents wouldn't want their kids to try to enter the sect. Concerned about the future, they sent out a few disciples to search the area. Wang Lin's father was still worried, so he followed them. And that's what caused the scene before him. After a while, someone sent in some medicine. Taizu's mother hastily thanked the person who delivered it and carefully fed it to her son. This was indeed medicine produced by an immortal sect. The effect was extremely good. After drinking it, Wang Lin felt that he had recovered quite a lot, and his wound began to ache a lot less. Wang Lin's parents were unceasingly bestowing words of comfort upon him. He wanted to explain everything to them, but he was unsure if they would believe him. At that moment, in a Heng Yue sect hall, several elders were sitting around listening to the disciple Jiang describe how he found Wang Lin. At the end of the long table, a red-faced man said disgruntledly, "What does the life and death of a mortal have to do with an immortal like me? Look at the other immortal schools, which of them are like us who send people to find a kid who tried to suicide because he wasn't selected? This is shameful." Next to him, a middle-aged man with a cold face said, "What Elder Ma said is correct. Of all the sects within the state of Jiao, only our Heng Yue sect is like this. But if that kid really died in our mountain range, parents would fear their children would all try suicide if they were rejected. Then, who would dare to send us their children?" An old man in a robe took a sip of tea and said slowly, "In reality, isn't it because our Heng Yue sect has declined that we must select disciples that are suitable for cultivation from mortals? If it was 500 years ago, who would care what the mortals think?" Finally, an old man full of wrinkles sighed and said, "If this youth tried to suicide once, he could try to suicide again. To prevent this issue from continuing, let us just make an exception, and accept him as a disciple." After he finished speaking, he gave a side glance to the middle-aged man. Chapter 10, Entering the Sect. The red-faced old man frowned with dissatisfaction and said, "Elder Li, is our Heng Yue sect really going to sink so low? To make an exception for the life and death of a mortal?" Elder Li opened his eyes and said in a cold voice, "Elder Ma, the patriarch, told me to handle this matter. If it's not handled properly, and this piece of trash attempts suicide a second time, and his parents spread that we forced their kid to suicide, isn't that more embarrassing? If you are willing to take responsibility on this matter, then I'll let you handle it." The middle-aged man quickly tried to make peace and said, "There is no need to argue. Why don't we let him become a disciple first, then after 8 or 10 years, when he fails to keep cultivating, we can send him back, and there will be no problem." The old man in the robe responded, "If other youths follow suit, what will we do?" The middle-aged man chuckled and said, "This is an easy task. After this, we have learned our lesson. When we fail people in the future, we should instill in the idea of not suicide, and that would solve this problem. As for this Wang Lin, since the matter is already this big, let us just take him as a disciple. One extra disciple doesn't matter." Aside from Elder Li, 2 other elders looked thoughtfully at the middle-aged man, not saying a word. The middle-aged man smiled and thought, "Oh, Wang Lin. Wang Lin. I have helped all I can. I have repaid you for the piece of metal your 4th uncle has given me. I'm really curious how a mortal managed to get this type of material." What the middle-aged man didn't know was that Wang Lin's 4th uncle had bought it from a blacksmith. He had seen many things, and as soon as he saw it, he knew it wasn't normal. This time, to let Taiju join the Heng Yue sect, he brought it out. As for what the metal was used for, he didn't know. A piece of metal changed Wang Lin's fate. When the news reached Wang Lin, he couldn't believe it. He was somehow accepted as a disciple for no apparent reason. 2 days later, he saw his parents off from the Heng Yue sect. After seeing the joy on his parents' faces, he decided to seriously cultivate here. However, his way of thinking was changed after his parents left. He was secretly called to the place where disciples get their work assigned and saw a shifty-looking youth. The youth's face was full of contempt. He looked at him and laughed. "So, you are Wang Lin, the kid that got to be a disciple by suiciding?" Wang Lin silently looked at the youth challenging him. The youth sneered, "Boy, starting tomorrow morning, you come to me for work. Your job is to fetch water, no less than 10 vats a day. If you can't finish the work, then no food for you, and if you continue for 7 days, then I'll tell the elders to kick you out of the sect. These are your clothes. Remember, honorary disciples can only wear gray. Once you are a true disciple, you will be assigned other colors. After he finished talking, he tossed the clothes to Wang Lin and closed his eyes. Wang Lin picked up his clothes and asked, "Where do I live?" The youth didn't even open his eyes and casually said, "Go north until you see a row of houses. Give your badge to the disciple there, and they will give you a room." Wang Lin left and headed north to the houses. The youth opened his eyes and said, with disdain, "To rely on suicide to join, he really is a waste." While walking in the Heng Yue sect, Wang Lin saw many disciples wearing grey uniforms in a hurry with pale and cold faces. Some had tools in their hands, and they were all rushing about. After going straight for a while, he saw a row of houses. There were a lot more disciples in grey here, but they hardly talked to each other. After he gave his badge to the yellow-clothed disciple that was in charge, the youth impatiently pointed to a room. Wang Lin had already gotten used to the cold expressions of all the people here. He got to his room and opened the door. It was a large room with 2 wooden beds, a table, and 2 chairs. They were all very clean and were about as new as the furniture at his house. He picked the bed that looked vacant. He placed his luggage down and lay in his bed. Although he had gotten into the Heng Yue sect, it wasn't what he was expecting. He thought that he was going to learn immortal techniques, but it seemed like his job was to fetch water. Thinking about this, he sighed and touched the stone bead in front of his chest. This was the treasure he had acquired. Wang Lin had read many books, and he knew the danger of exposing it, as many people would aim for this treasure. A short while later, night fell, and an extremely tired youth in grey opened the door and entered. He was stunned when he saw Wang Lin, then proceeded to pass out on his bed without saying a word. Wang Lin didn't care. He knew that he had to wake up early. He touched his stomach, then took out some sweet potatoes. His parents brought them for him to eat when they went out searching for him, and since he was accepted, his parents gave all the remaining food to him. The sweet potato was very sweet. As Wang Lin was eating, the youth woke up and eyed the sweet potato. While his mouth watered, he said in a low voice, "Can I have a piece?" Wang Lin took out a few pieces and said, "I have a lot here. If you'd like, have some more." The youth quickly picked up the food and scarfed it down, then went over to the table and poured himself a glass of water. He exclaimed, "Damn it! I haven't eaten anything in 2 days. So, what's your name?" Wang Lin said his name. The youth suddenly laughed and said, "So you are Wang Lin, the trash that entered the Heng Yue sect by attempting suicide." He suddenly realized what he had done and said, "Brother, my name is Jiang Hu. To tell you the truth, there is no one in the sect that doesn't know about you, so please don't blame me for what I said before. In fact, I admire you for being able to enter the sect this way." Wang Lin laughed bitterly. He didn't try to explain and passed over a few pieces of sweet potato. Jiang Hu quickly accepted it and took a few bites, then said, "Wang Lin, you better leave some of it for yourself. You are new here. Who knows what evil things that yellow weasel will try to do. Damn it, he doesn't even treat us like humans."